They thought they could toss me out like garbage after I sacrificed my youth programming the brain of their tech empire, just to clear the path for his mistress. But Julian and the arrogant Sterling family made a fatal error. They forgot I held the only encryption key. When I walked into the boardroom with $85 million of proof, her smug smile vanished faster than their crashing stock price. My name is Elena, and standing beneath the crushing weight of the crystal chandeliers at the Plaza Hotel, I felt less like a wife and more like a prop that had served its purpose. I reached up to straighten Julian's bow tie, my fingers brushing the sharp line of his jaw. He did not lean into my touch the way he used to. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed over my shoulder, scanning the ballroom for people who mattered more than I did. The air smelled of expensive perfume and old money, a scent that always made me feel like an imposter despite the ring on my finger. My mind flashed back to the reality behind this glamour. For 8 years, while Julian was out shaking hands and building his reputation, I was buried in the windowless basement of our first townhouse. I worked 18 hours a day, fueled by stale coffee and the desperate need to prove myself. I was the one who built Athena. I wrote every line of code, designed every neural pathway, and fixed every bug while Julian slept. I was 32 years old, but looking in the mirror that morning, I saw the gray hairs and the deep lines of exhaustion that belonged to someone twice my age. I had given everything to create the artificial intelligence that was about to change the world. The murmuring crowd went silent as my father-in-law, Richard Sterling, stepped onto the podium. He looked like a titan of industry, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. He announced that the Athena project was officially filing for its IPO with a starting valuation of $2 billion. The applause was deafening. I squeezed Julian's arm, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was the moment. Richard had promised me the chief operating officer position as soon as we went public. It was the validation I had bled for. Richard smiled a shark-like grin. And to lead Athena into this new era, I am proud to introduce our new chief operating officer, a woman who embodies the future and elegance of Sterling AI. Please welcome Sierra Vance. The applause continued, but the sound seemed to drain out of my world. The spotlight did not find me. It swung to the left, illuminating a woman in a backless red silk gown that clung to her like a second skin. Sierra. She was 23 years old, a former runway model, the daughter of a wealthy board member, and a woman I had seen whispering with Julian far too often. I turned to Julian, my voice trembling. Julian, what is happening? Richard promised me that role. I built this system. Julian finally looked at me, and the coldness in his eyes hit me harder than a physical blow. He peeled my fingers off his tuxedo jacket as if I were covered in filth. Elena, be realistic. You are just a code monkey. You do not have the pedigree or the class to be the face of Sterling AI. Sierra has the image we need to sell this stock. You are invisible. Sierra glided over to our table, a flute of champagne dangling from her fingers. She looked me up and down with a pitying sneer. Oh, Elena, that dress looks like something you bought at a discount rack 5 years ago. You really should be grateful Julian let you play around in his office for this long. It is embarrassing. Before I could defend myself, Julian thrust a thick manila envelope into my hands. It felt heavy, like a stone. What is this? I asked, my throat tight. Julian took a sip of his drink and did not even blink. Divorce papers. And your notice of termination. We are restructuring the personnel for the public offering. Your services are no longer required. Rage flared hot in my chest. I tried to shout, to tell the investors surrounding us that I was the architect of their fortune, that Athena was my mind, not his. But Richard Sterling was already pointing a finger at me. Security, get this woman out of here. Richard barked. She is trespassing and causing a disturbance. 2 massive guards in dark suits grabbed me by the arms. I was hauled across the polished marble floor, my heels skidding as I fought them. They dragged me past the colleagues I had trained, past the investors I had made rich, and shoved me out the side exit like a bag of trash. I stumbled onto the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind me. It was late December, and the wind cut through my thin dress like a knife. I had no coat. I had no husband. I had no job. I stood there shivering, snowflakes melting on my bare skin, and looked back through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom. Inside, the golden light was warm and inviting. I watched Julian raise his champagne glass high. He clinked it against Sierra's, and they laughed, throwing their heads back in triumph. They looked like the kings and queens of New York. I stood alone in the cold, staring at the glass that separated my life from theirs, and realized that to them, I had never been a person. I was just a tool they had finished using. I arrived back at the Tribeca penthouse, shivering and numb, only to find that my fingerprint no longer opened the private elevator. The doorman, a man whose daughter I had helped get into a coding camp, stared at his shoes and told me he had strict orders not to let me up. I tried to pay for a hotel room with our joint credit card, but the terminal flashed a decline message. I tried my personal debit card next. Declined. In the span of 2 hours, Julian had not just divorced me, he had erased my existence. The next morning, I sat in a plastic chair in the office of Arthur Vance, the Sterling's personal attack dog masquerading as a lawyer. He slid a document across the mahogany desk with a sympathetic smile that did not reach his eyes. He reminded me of the prenuptial agreement I had signed 3 days before the wedding. I had been young and blinded by love, trusting Julian when he said it was just a formality for the board. I had never read the fine print. Vance pointed to a clause on page 40. It stated that any intellectual property created during the marriage was classified as work for hire and belonged exclusively to Sterling AI. 8 years of my life, the neural networks, the machine learning algorithms, the very soul of Athena. All of it legally belonged to the man who had thrown me out into the snow. I walked out of that office with nothing but the clothes on my back and a check for $5,000, which Vance called a generosity. My fall from grace was swift and brutal. I moved from the skyline of Manhattan to a basement apartment in Queens that smelled of mildew and boiled cabbage. The ceiling was so low I could touch it, and the only window looked out onto a grimy sidewalk where people spat as they walked by. To pay the first month of rent and the security deposit, I had to sell my grandmother's vintage earrings and my engagement ring. The pawnbroker gave me 10 cents on the dollar, knowing I was desperate, and I took the cash with trembling hands. I tried to fight back the only way I knew how. I updated my resume and applied to every major tech firm in the city. I knew I was the best architect in the field, but the interviews never came. When I finally got a rejection email from a recruiter I used to know, she hinted that I had been blacklisted. The Sterlings had spread rumors that I was unstable, that I had attempted to steal proprietary data, and that I was fired for gross misconduct. No one wanted to hire a liability, especially one who had made an enemy of a $2 billion giant. The darkest moment came on a rainy Tuesday when I walked past a newsstand. There, staring back at me from the cover of Forbes magazine, was Sierra. The headline read, "The New AI Queen" in bold yellow letters. The article described her as a visionary genius who had single-handedly ushered Sterling AI into the future. She was taking credit for my sleepless nights, my breakthroughs, and my sacrifice. I bought a bottle of cheap wine and sat on the floor of my damp apartment, drinking until the image of her face blurred. My phone remained silent. The friends we had hosted at dinner parties, the socialites I had vacationed with in the Hamptons, they all vanished. They were loyal to power, not people. I spent days lying in bed, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, watching the mold spread like a slow infection. I felt hollowed out. I was ready to let the darkness swallow me whole. Then, my phone buzzed. It was my mother calling from back home. I almost ignored it, ashamed to let her hear my defeat. But when I answered, her voice cut through the fog. She did not tell me to come home. She did not tell me to give up. She told me that we come from a line of women who survive winters that kill lesser men. She asked me if I was a victim or a fighter. I hung up the phone and looked at myself in the cracked bathroom mirror. I looked terrible, but for the first time in weeks, the tears had stopped. I was not done yet. I traded the ergonomic chair of a C-suite executive for the worn plastic seats of the subway to keep the lights on in my basement hole. I took a job as a specialized courier for high-stakes law firms. It was ironic. The hands that had once woven complex neural networks and written code worth billions were now calloused and dry from hauling bankers' boxes filled with other people's secrets. My back ached constantly, a dull throb that served as a metronome for my new life. I navigated the labyrinth of the transit system, dodging tourists and rats alike, invisible to the city that I had once helped modernize. One rainy Tuesday, the dispatch app pinged with a delivery address that made my stomach turn. One Sterling Plaza. I considered canceling, but I needed the $40. I pulled my cap lower and walked into the glass lobby I used to own. The receptionist was new, a girl with bright gum and a bored expression. She looked at my dripping raincoat and the heavy box in my arms with unconcealed disdain. She told me to use the service elevator around the back, speaking to me slowly as if I were simple. I did not argue. I just wanted to drop the package and leave. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. As the service elevator doors began to slide shut, a hand stopped them. My heart hammered against my ribs as Julian and Sierra stepped in. They were arguing about dinner reservations, oblivious to the soaking wet courier in the corner. Then Sierra saw me. Her eyes widened, not with guilt, but with malicious amusement. She held a steaming cup of latte in her hand. As the elevator jolted upward, she feigned a stumble. The hot brown liquid splashed all over the front of my cheap windbreaker, soaking through to my skin. "Oops," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. She crumpled it and tossed it at my feet. "That should cover the dry cleaning." "Sweetie, keep the change." I looked at Julian. I waited for him to say something, to defend the woman he had been married to for nearly a decade. But he just stared at the floor numbers, counting them down, refusing to acknowledge my existence. His cowardice was more repulsing than her cruelty. In that moment, the last shred of heartbreak I felt for him evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard disgust. I bent down and picked up the money. I did not throw it back. I did not scream. I pocketed it silently. When the doors opened, I delivered my package and walked out into the rain. That night, I taped the coffee-stained $100 bill to the mirror in my bathroom. It was not money to me. It was a declaration of war. Every time I brushed my teeth, I looked at Benjamin Franklin's face and remembered the look on hers. I could not sleep. The humiliation burned too hot. I paced the small room, my mind racing back through the timeline of my relationship with Julian, looking for cracks in the fortress they had built. I replayed the early days, the college years, the nights before Sterling AI was even a registered entity. Then, it hit me. When the security team had raided the penthouse to seize my electronics, they had taken the iMac, the tablets, and the company phone. But they had missed something. I dropped to my knees and dragged a dusty cardboard box out from under the bed. Inside, buried under old textbooks and tangled cables, was my clunky laptop from graduate school. It was heavy, covered in stickers, and had not been turned on in years. But it was mine. And unlike the company devices, this machine predated my marriage. It predated the company. I plugged it in, holding my breath as the fan whirred to life, praying that the battery still held a charge and, more importantly, that the hard drive still held my memories. The office of Thorne and Associates in Brooklyn smelled of old paper, stale coffee, and aggressive litigation. It was a far cry from the glass towers of Manhattan, but everyone knew Marcus Thorne was the kind of lawyer who ate corporate giants for breakfast. I was just there to drop off a box of depositions, my cap pulled low to hide my face. I set the heavy box down on his desk with a thud, turning to leave immediately. "Wait a minute," a gravelly voice called out. I froze. Marcus Thorne was sitting behind a mountain of paperwork, peering at me over the rim of his glasses. He was not looking at my face. He was looking at the box I had just delivered. "You indexed the cross-references on the outside label," he said, pointing a pen at the box. "And you color-coded the priority timestamps. Couriers do not do that. Paralegals barely do that. That is the logic of a systems architect." I turned back slowly. Old habits died hard. I had organized the chaos because I could not stand disorder, even if I was just delivering it. Marcus stood up and walked around the desk. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing not with recognition of the scandal, but with the sharp intuition of a predator recognizing a fellow hunter. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "You are the woman Sterling tried to bury. I do not read the tabloids. Elena. I read the patents. And I know that nobody writes code that clean without leaving a fingerprint." My heart began to race. Marcus leaned against his desk and crossed his arms. "If I were you," he said, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper, "I would stop looking at what you lost and start looking at what you owned before you signed it away. Check your original authorship rights. If that code existed before the ring went on your finger, the prenuptial agreement is just expensive toilet paper." I left his office with my pulse thundering in my ears. I ran the rest of the way to the subway, clutching the strap of my bag. When I got back to my basement apartment, I locked the door and pulled out the clunky laptop I had salvaged. It felt like handling a bomb. I plugged it in and pressed the power button. The screen flickered, gray and dusty, before the startup chime of an operating system from 9 years ago filled the room. My fingers flew across the keyboard. It was muscle memory. I bypassed the old passwords and dove straight into the directory architecture. I needed to find the alpha build. I needed a date. I navigated through layers of digital sediment until I found a folder named Project Athena Alpha. I held my breath and opened the Properties tab. Created, November 14th, 2014. I gasped. The date stared back at me, glowing in the dim light. I had written the core kernel of the Athena algorithm 5 months before I married Julian. I had registered it as an open-source project under my maiden name to protect the integrity of the logic. It predated Sterling AI. It predated the marriage. It predated the lies. But that was not the smoking gun. I frantically opened the digital copy of the intellectual property transfer agreement I had saved on the drive years ago, the one I had signed when we incorporated the company. I scrolled past the dense legal jargon until I found the section on asset transfer. There, buried at the bottom in a font size so small it was almost invisible, was Addendum 4B. I read it out loud to the empty room, my voice shaking. In the event that the primary creator is terminated from the company without cause, all rights to the foundational source code shall automatically revert to the original author effective immediately. I sat back, stunned. Without cause. Julian and Richard had been so arrogant, so to get rid of me quickly to make room for Sierra, that they had fired me for restructuring personnel. That was a termination without cause. If they had framed me for embezzlement or negligence, they might have kept the rights, but they were too lazy to lie properly. By firing me to clear the decks for their IPO, they had accidentally triggered the reversion clause. A cold, sharp smile spread across my face. Sterling AI was 48 hours away from launching an initial public offering valued at $2 billion. They were selling the future to Wall Street, but they had forgotten one tiny detail. They did not own the product they were selling. I did. I laid the external hard drive and the printed contract on Marcus Thorne's desk. The only sound in the cluttered office was the hum of the air conditioner and the rustle of paper as Marcus read the same paragraph for the 3rd time. He was a man who had made a career out of finding needles in haystacks, but I had just handed him a loaded gun. He finally looked up, and the cynical haze that usually covered his eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory gleam. This is ironclad, Marcus said, his voice low. The timestamp on the open source registration predates the incorporation of Sterling AI by 6 months. And with Addendum 4, B triggered by your termination, the intellectual property rights did not just vanish. They snapped back to you like a rubber band. I leaned forward. I do not just want a settlement. Marcus, if we settle, they pay me off with pennies and make billions on the IPO. I want to stop the offering. I want them to realize that the foundation of their empire is built on rented land, and the lease has expired. Marcus leaned back in his chair and cracked his knuckles. He told me he would take the case on a contingency fee basis. He would not take a dime up front, but when we won, he would take 30% of the damages. It was a gamble for him, but looking at the evidence, we both knew the odds were in our favor. We spent the next 6 hours drafting a cease and desist order. It was not a polite request. It was a legal notification that Sterling AI was operating on stolen technology and had 48 hours to cease all operations using the Athena core or face immediate federal litigation. While we were weaponizing the law, chaos was beginning to unfold at the Sterling headquarters. I monitored the developer forums and tech news sites from my phone. Threads were popping up about massive latency spikes in the Athena interface. Clients were reporting data retrieval errors. The system was not just slowing down, it was rejecting commands. I knew exactly what was happening. Sierra and her team of junior engineers were trying to optimize code they did not understand, and the system was treating their inputs as foreign intrusions. Wall Street rumors began to swirl. The IPO was supposed to be the tech event of the decade, but whispers of technical instability were making investors nervous. The stock price of their parent holding company dipped by 3% in an afternoon. Then, my phone rang. I stared at the screen. It was a number I had deleted but knew by heart. Julian. I let it ring 3 times before picking up, forcing my breathing to remain steady. Hello, Julian, I said. Elena, he said. His voice was smooth, carrying that practiced executive calm, but I could hear the tightness in his throat. It has been a while. Look, I know things ended poorly, but we are professionals. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch until he was forced to fill it. We have a small situation here, he continued, his tone shifting to a patronizing breeziness. Sierra is incredibly busy with the press tour for the IPO, so she has not had time to look at some minor bugs in the legacy code. I thought, for old time's sake, you could come in and consult, just for a few hours. We can offer you a standard contractor rate, $500 for the day. The audacity was breathtaking. He had thrown me out into the snow, stripped me of my dignity, and now he wanted me to fix his $2 billion mistake for $500. He truly believed I was that desperate. He thought I was still the woman who sought his approval. I am afraid I cannot do that. Julian, I said, my voice cold and flat. Come on, Elena, he snapped, his patience fraying. Do not be petty. It is just a glitch. Tell us the patch command and I will wire the money to you instantly. I know you need it. I walked over to the mirror where the crumpled $100 bill from Sierra still hung. It is not a glitch. Julian, I said. It is a security feature. The system has detected unauthorized administrative access from users who do not have the original encryption signature. It is locking down to protect the core. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The arrogance was evaporating, replaced by a creeping dread. What do you mean, unauthorized? He whispered. I mean that the system recognizes its master, I said. And Sierra is not it. You fired the only person who knows the handshake protocol. That is not a bug. That is the lock. And you do not have the key. I hung up the phone before he could say another word. For the first time in months, I did not feel like a victim. I felt like the hunter. On Monday morning, precisely at 9 o'clock, a process server walked into the lobby of Sterling AI. It was not me this time. I was done delivering packages. I was now delivering consequences. The server handed a thick envelope to the receptionist. the same one who had mocked me days earlier and demanded an immediate signature. Inside was a formal cease and desist order, co-signed by Marcus Thorne, demanding that Sterling AI remove all instances of the Athena core source code from their servers within 48 hours or face federal litigation for intellectual property theft. The reaction inside the glass tower was immediate and explosive. I was not there to see it, but the grapevine of the tech world is fast and porous. I heard that when Richard Sterling read the first page of the legal notice. He hurled his ceramic espresso cup across the executive suite. It shattered against the white wall, leaving a dark brown stain that mirrored the stain spreading across his company's reputation. He screamed for Arthur Vance, demanding to know how a basement-dwelling coder could hold his $2 billion IPO hostage. But Vance, the legal shark who had seemed so invincible when he kicked me out, was toothless. He sat in the war room, sweating through his expensive shirt as he stared at the evidence we had attached. The timestamps on my original open-source registration were irrefutable. November 14th, 2014. The logic was binary 0 or 1, true or false. The code belonged to me before it ever belonged to them. And because they had fired me without cause to save money, they had triggered the very clause that stripped them of their rights. Vance had to tell Richard the one thing a billionaire never wants to hear. He told him that I was right. Panic trickled down from the executive suite to the engineering floor. Sierra was in full meltdown mode. She was scheduled to appear on live national television in 48 hours to demonstrate Athena's advanced conversational capabilities to the world. It was supposed to be the final hype event before the stock market launch. But the system was dying. The security lockout I had initiated was spreading like a virus. Every time her team tried to access the administrative panel to prep for the demo, they were met with a red screen that simply read, "Access denied." She was the face of the future, and she was currently locked out of the present. By 1 p.m, my phone rang. It was Vance's office. They requested an emergency mediation meeting. They wanted to settle. Marcus and I arrived at the Sterling legal offices at 3 o'clock. I did not wear my courier uniform. I had taken the last of my savings and bought a suit that fit like armor navy blue, sharp-shouldered, and intimidating. I pulled my hair back into a severe bun and wore heels that clicked against the marble floor with the rhythm of a marching army. When I walked into the conference room, the air left the room. Julian looked up, expecting to see the broken, weeping woman he had discarded in the snow. Instead, he saw someone he did not recognize. Richard Sterling sat at the head of the table, his face a mottled purple from suppressed rage. He did not stand up. He did not offer a hand. He simply slid a check across the polished mahogany table. "We are prepared to make this go away." Richard growled, "This is a check for $5 million. It is a generous consulting fee for your past work and a settlement for the divorce. Take it. Sign the non-disclosure agreement and get out of my city. $5 million. It was a fortune. It was enough to disappear, to start over, to never work another day in my life." Julian watched me, his shoulders relaxing. He offered a tentative, arrogant smile, thinking he had won. He thought everyone had a price. He thought I was just a desperate ex-wife looking for a payout. I reached out and picked up the check. I looked at the number, verified the signature, and then, slowly and deliberately, I tore it down the middle. The sound of the ripping paper was loud in the silent room. I put the two halves together and tore them again, letting the pieces flutter down onto the mahogany like worthless confetti. "I do not want your pocket change, Richard," I said, my voice steady and cutting. "I do not want a payout. I want ownership." I turned to look at Julian. His smile had vanished. His face went pale, and his hands began to tremble slightly on the table. He looked at the torn check, then up at my eyes, and for the first time, he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He realized that the woman he had betrayed was no longer the submissive partner who stayed in the basement. I was the architect of his reality, and I had just decided to bring the roof down on his head. Sierra Vance was not a woman used to losing. When the legal notices hit and the system locked her out, panic made her reckless. She did exactly what I hoped she would do. Terrified of losing her position as the face of the company just days before the IPO, she tried to bypass the lockout by hiring an underground hacker. She thought she could brute force her way through my architecture. It was the digital equivalent of trying to break into a bank vault with a sledgehammer. She did not know that I had anticipated a hostile takeover years ago. I had installed a dead man switch, a dormant line of code designed to detect unauthorized decryption attempts. The moment her hacker touched the kernel, the trap snapped shut. It did not just block them, it nuked the bridge. The system went into a defensive fugue state. It encrypted every terabyte of client data, including financial records, personal identities, and predictive models, rendering it all useless static. On every monitor in the Sterling AI headquarters, the slick blue interface vanished, replaced by a black screen with a single line of blinking red text that read, "Access denied," followed by copyright infringement. The market reacts instantly to uncertainty, and this was not just uncertainty, it was a catastrophe. Within 2 hours of the opening bell, Sterling AI's pre-market valuation did not just stumble, it cratered. The stock of their parent company plunged 15%. Billions of dollars in potential market cap evaporated before lunch. The news channels were in a frenzy, showing live shots of the chaos outside the Sterling building. But the real drama was happening inside the glass walls of the executive suite. My former assistant texted me the details. Julian had lost his composure completely. He dragged Sierra into his office, the one visible to the entire floor, and screamed at her. He called her incompetent. He called her a liability. He did not care who heard. The facade of their perfect power couple dissolved into ugly, raw panic. Julian was watching his empire burn, and he realized too late that he had handed the matches to a child. I watched the live feed from a business news channel in my tiny apartment, sipping a cup of tea. It was a cold, quiet satisfaction, but I was not done. I wanted to make sure Sierra could never rise from the ashes. I had done my homework while I was sitting in that basement in Queens. I had dug into Sierra's past. She claimed to have a degree from a prestigious Ivy League university, a credential that justified her rapid ascent to the C-suite. It was a lie. She had dropped out after 1 semester of general studies. I sat at my laptop and composed a single email. The subject line was, "The Truth." I attached the official registrar transcripts I had obtained, proving her fraud. I sent it anonymously to the top 3 tech journalists in the city and blind copied Sierra. The fallout was immediate. By the evening news, the headline was no longer "The New AI Queen." It was "The Fraud of Fifth Avenue." Sierra was being ripped apart on social media. Her brand deals were canceled within the hour. Her credibility was shattered, cornered, and humiliated. Sierra did not go quietly. She realized her golden ticket was shredding itself, so she turned on the only person left. She threatened Julian. She told him that if he fired her, she would release texts and emails proving he knew about the intellectual property theft from the beginning. She demanded a payout, or she would drag him down to hell with her. The rats were finally eating each other. Richard Sterling was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a man who destroyed anyone who stood in his path. And when the legal notices hit his desk, he stopped playing by the rules. He called in favors from the darkest corners of his network. Suddenly, black SUVs with tinted windows were parked across the street from my basement apartment day and night. Men in dark suits followed me to the grocery store, making sure I saw the guns bulging under their jackets. They threatened Marcus Thorne, promising to have him disbarred and audited by the IRS if he did not drop the case. Then came the smear campaign. It was vicious and calculated. They leaked falsified medical records to the tabloids, claiming I had been institutionalized for bipolar disorder and paranoid delusions. They paid a corrupt psychiatrist to sign a statement saying I was mentally unfit and that my claims of authorship were nothing more than the fantasies of a hysterical ex-wife. The headlines were brutal, painting me as an unstable stalker obsessed with destroying her successful husband. But they had made a critical error. They assumed I was reacting emotionally, but I was operating logically. I had anticipated their dirty tactics. For months, I had been recording every interaction. I had the phone call where Richard threatened to make me disappear if I did not take the settlement. I had the voicemails where Julian sounded weak and complicit, admitting that they needed to silence me to save the IPO. I did not take this evidence to the police. I took it to the court of public opinion. I arranged a clandestine meeting at a diner in Jersey City with a senior investigative journalist from the New York Times. She was a woman known for taking down corrupt politicians, and she listened intently as I laid out the timeline. I gave her everything. The original source code timestamps, the fraudulent medical documents, the recordings of the threats, and a detailed log of the workplace bullying I had endured for 8 years. On Sunday morning, the bomb detonated. The article took up the entire front page above the fold. The headline screamed, "The Truth Behind Sterling AI, the Forgotten Genius and the Billion-Dollar Scam." It was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. It exposed the theft of the Athena core, Sierra's academic fraud, and the Sterling family's illegal intimidation tactics. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. By noon, the Securities and Exchange Commission issued a public statement announcing a formal investigation into Sterling AI for fraud and market manipulation. The investors who had been lining up for the IPO fled in a panic. The venture capital firms that had backed Richard pulled their funding, citing a breach of ethics clauses. The company was radioactive. That evening, a heavy rain was falling over Queens. I heard a frantic pounding on my door. I opened it to find Julian standing there. He was unrecognizable. The polished CEO in the tuxedo was gone. In his place was a soaking wet, unshaven man with wild eyes. He looked at me and collapsed to his knees in the mud outside my door. He grabbed the hem of my jeans, sobbing. "Elena, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "We can fix this. I will fire Sierra. I will throw her out tonight. I will give you 50% of the company. Just stop the lawsuit. Please. Elena, you are destroying us." I looked down at the man who had once told me I was not enough. He was offering me half of his kingdom, but he did not realize that his kingdom was already burning, and I was the one holding the torch. Watching him ruin his expensive Italian suit in the mud, I felt a terrifying absence of emotion. He still did not understand. He thought this was a negotiation about money. He thought he could buy his way out of betrayal. 50% is the number for yesterday, I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the storm like a razor. Today, the price is different. Julian looked up, his face streaked with rain and tears, confusion clouding his eyes. He opened his mouth to beg again, to offer 60% or 70%, but I did not give him the chance. I stepped back into the dry warmth of my apartment and slammed the heavy metal door in his face. I turned the deadbolt with a loud, final click. Outside, I could hear him screaming my name, pounding his fists against the steel until his knuckles must have bled. I leaned my forehead against the cool metal of the door for a single second, took a deep breath, and walked away. I slept soundly that night while the Sterling dynasty crumbled. By the next morning, the panic at Sterling AI had mutated into a full-blown coup. The board of directors, a collection of ruthless venture capitalists and old money investors, finally realized that their loyalty to the Sterling family was going to cost them everything. With the stock price in freefall and the SEC investigators seizing hard drives, they convened an emergency meeting. Their agenda was simple. They needed a scapegoat, and they needed a savior. Richard and Julian were the cancer, and I was the only surgeon who could operate. I received the call at 8 o'clock in the morning from the chairman of the board. His voice, usually booming and authoritative, was thin and deferential. He asked me to come to the headquarters immediately to discuss a settlement and the restoration of the Athena system. He called it a collaborative resolution. I knew it was an unconditional surrender. "I will be there in an hour," I told him, "but I have one non-negotiable condition." "Anything," he said quickly. "I want the board meeting broadcast live on the internal company network." I said. Every employee, from the junior developers to the janitorial staff, needs to see this. No closed doors, no secret deals. If you want me to unlock the system, you will do it in front of the entire company. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The chairman knew I was asking for a public execution. He knew I intended to strip the Sterling family of their dignity in front of the very people they had terrorized. But he had no choice. The system was dead, and I held the only key. Agreed, he whispered. I hung up the phone and began to dress. I did not put on the courier uniform that had made me invisible. I did not put on the sensible, modest clothes I used to wear to avoid outshining Julian. I chose a white suit, sharp and tailored, that looked like a blade against the gray backdrop of the city. I pulled my hair back tight. I applied red lipstick that looked like war paint. I grabbed the small USB drive from my desk, the one containing the encryption key. It weighed less than an ounce, but it carried the weight of $1 billion verdict. As the taxi crossed the bridge into Manhattan, I looked at the skyline. I was heading back to the skyscraper where I had been humiliated, dragged out by security, and tossed into the snow. But I was not returning as a victim. I was not returning as a bitter ex-wife seeking alimony. I was walking into the lion's den, but the lions were toothless, and I was the one holding the whip. I was not there to argue. I was there to take everything. The elevator doors to the 50th floor slid open with a soft chime, the same sound that had mocked me the night I was dragged out by security. This time, I walked out into the executive boardroom not as a trespasser, but as the only living thing capable of resurrecting the dead. The room was silent. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and fear. Sierra was sitting in the corner, hunched over in a chair that looked too big for her, her face buried in her hands. She looked small. Richard and Julian sat at the head of the table, their skin the color of ash. They did not look like titans of industry anymore. They looked like men who were watching the hangman tie the knot. The chairman of the board stood up. He was a man who controlled billions, but his hands were shaking as he looked at me. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He asked me what I wanted to unlock the system. He offered $20 million, then 30, then $50 million. He threw numbers at me like he was trying to put out a fire with paper bills. I walked to the center of the room and placed the small silver USB drive on the mahogany table. It made a sharp click that echoed in the silence. I am not selling the encryption key, I said, my voice filling the room without trembling. I am using it to buy the company. Richard slammed his fist on the table, shouting that I was insane. I ignored him and looked directly at the shareholders. I told them the truth. I told them that due to the scandal and the technical blackout, their stock was currently trading at the value of garbage. The company was worthless without Athena. I offered them a trade. I would grant the company a perpetual license to use my source code in exchange for 51% of the voting stock and the immediate position of chief executive officer. Richard screamed that he would never allow it, but the room ignored him. The investors did not care about the Sterling family pride. They cared about their portfolios. One by one, they raised their hands. The motion passed unanimously. They sacrificed the king to save the kingdom. The lawyers slid the papers across the table. I signed my name with a steady hand. I watched the ink dry, feeling the shift in the universe. I stood up and looked at the three people who had tried to erase me. As the new CEO of Sterling AI, my first act is to address the leadership crisis, I said, my voice cold and absolute. Richard Sterling, Julian Sterling, and Sierra Vance, you are hereby terminated effective immediately for gross ethical violations and professional incompetence. Richard looked like he was having a stroke. Julian simply stared at me, his mouth hanging open. I turned to the door and signaled the security team, the same men who had thrown me out months ago. I ordered them to escort the three former employees out of the building immediately. I told them that they were not allowed to return to their offices to collect personal items. They were to leave with nothing but the clothes on their backs. As the guards moved in, Julian broke. He scrambled toward me, reaching out to grab my hand, his eyes wide with a pathetic mixture of regret and desperation. "Elena, wait," he pleaded. "We can work this out together." I stepped back, recoiling from his touch as if he were contagious. I smoothed the lapel of my white suit and looked him in the eye. "You told me I was not good enough for Sterling," I said. "You were right. Sterling is too small for me. Now get out of my company." I watched them being marched into the elevator, their protests dying as the doors slid shut. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with power. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the sprawling grid of New York City. The snow was falling again, just like that night, but I was no longer out in the cold. I plugged the USB drive into the main server terminal. On the massive wall of monitors, the red warning lights flickered and died. A moment later, they bloomed into a calm, steady green. Athena was back online. I did not need a husband or a legacy name to define my worth. I was the architect. I was the code. I was Athena. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment down below and share your thoughts on Elena's revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people.